if you were hoping that I would kick Season 4 off with a bang, I'll instead start us off with a reference to Firework, the obvious masterpiece by Katy Perry. I have no casual transition to tell you that that song is 15 years old, and that its age makes me feel personally attacked. I decided it was only fair to share that attack with each of you. Apparently, there is a not insignificant portion of service members that do feel like a plastic bag, drifting through the wind, wanting to start again. When service members ignite the light and take flight from their commitment, their desertion doesn't just leave the Department of Defense in awe. The DoD goes looking for them for the months, years, or decades it takes to track them down. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. In 2018, Private DeQuarries Robinson was stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma. Shortly after Christmas in 2018, Robinson failed to show up for work, and continued to fail to show up for work until September 24th, 2019. I don't have more details about where he was during that time, what role he was trained to serve, or how weird it was when he strolled back in after 9 months of being a no-call, no-show. 6 weeks after he returned, in November 2019, Robinson packed his wife and their children into the family car and drove from his duty station of Fort Sill, Oklahoma, to his wife's home in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Once they arrived, Robinson's wife withdrew all the money from their shared account and left him with the children. In February 2020, Robinson's company commander completed a deserter warrant for him. In the meantime, Robinson picked up a job at McDonald's, crashing with a friend, and for a short time with his brother, as he worked to provide for his children. For years, Robinson kept up the grind, just a few miles away from Fort Bragg, an Army base in Fayetteville and reminder of the job he wasn't showing up for. The problem with his second job at McDonald's is that he never told Uncle Sam anything. He didn't call to explain that he felt stuck in Fayetteville. He didn't consider that if he resumed work at his first job, he'd have a living wage, a housing allowance, and health insurance. In 2021, Robinson again packed up his kids, heading west to Texas, driving past the duty station he abandoned. I'm not sure what jobs Robinson worked when he first arrived in Texas, but in March 2023, he was hired at Moxie Pest Control in Irving. He claims that with the stability that job afforded him, he resolved to remain out of the Army. The job required Robinson to solicit homeowners to purchase pest control services. For what it's worth, you should double-check the wire mesh covering the entrances to your attic, especially if you have any foliage that touches your roof or eaves. Failing to do so might result in returning from a week away and sitting bolt upright at 2 a.m. to the sound of rats chittering in your attic in the space above your bed. But that's not a solicitation for me to perform the work. 3 months after Robinson started his new job, a grumbly homeowner filed a complaint and summoned the police, alleging Robinson was soliciting without a permit. When the police stopped him on June 13, 2023, they ran a basic background check. Then they detained Robinson when that basic background check returned a deserter warrant. 7 days later, Robinson's chain of command retrieved him from local confinement and transferred him back to Fort Sill. The source materials don't describe what happened to Robinson's children when he was detained, nor does it probably much matter to the military justice system. If pressed, I would guess they were taken into protective custody through child welfare services, at least until a family member could intervene. Originally, the Army charged Robinson for one specification of desertion, one specification of absence without leave, and one specification of making a false official statement. Robinson agreed to plead guilty to one specification of desertion and one specification of absence without leave. That specification of making a false official statement was dismissed as part of his plea agreement. When he came in to make his guilty plea, the judge didn't ask, "Hey man, what specific date over those 3.5 years did you look around and go, yeah, this is the life, now I'm definitely not returning to the Army?" But during that plea colloquy, Robinson explained that he didn't think the Army would be able to help him with his family issues, even though he was within spitting distance of a robust Army base. After making their Providence inquiries, the military judge accepted Robinson's plea that he committed desertion on or around November 4th, 2019, sentencing him to confinement for 30 days and a bad conduct discharge. Technically, the judge sentenced Robinson to 30 days for the desertion and 15 days for being AWOL, but ordered them served concurrently. This case isn't really all that noteworthy, or at least that's kind of what I thought. There aren't any remarkable details that stand out to me. There didn't seem to be a huge precipitating event or dramatic outcome. This isn't, for example, comparable to Bo Bergdahl walking away from his post in Afghanistan and getting swooped up by the Taliban and held as a prisoner of war. I think what actually stands out is that Robinson was apprehended and prosecuted. For a little bit of context to that statement, in the 13 years between 2001 and 2014, the Army prosecuted about 1,900 cases of desertion, but listed more than 20,000 soldiers as deserters during that time period. About half of the 1,900 soldiers that were prosecuted for desertion pled guilty. 78 went to contested court-martial and were convicted. That leaves about 875 prosecutions that we don't have any insight into their resolution. It's not really that desertion is particularly difficult to prove. Article 85 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice reads in part, "Any member of the armed forces who, without authority, goes or remains absent from his unit with the intent to remain therefrom permanently is guilty of desertion." That makes it a specific intent crime. A defendant has to have intended to remain away at some point during their absence. And courts-martial for desertion leave space for an accused to explain post-traumatic stress or family problems that influenced their decision-making. The rate of desertion increases for those returning from combat deployments or preparing for them. It increases in service members in the throes of a divorce or who are caregiving for sick children. Service members facing court-martial or other disciplinary actions are also more likely to skip town. When I started researching for this episode, I recalled vague details about a deserter who was picked up and prosecuted after decades away from the service. I couldn't remember much more than that and plugged in what sketchy details lingered in the back of my mind and hit search. It turns out that my sketchy details are applicable to more than one case. So before I switch back to tell you about how Robinson's appeal went, I want to share 2 short stories about airmen who walked out of the job and were found decades later in Florida. On July 6, 1977, Airman First Class Jeffrey Michaels failed to report for duty at the Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota. If you want to hear about another case in Minot, do give episode 33 a listen. Getting out of Minot seemed to do a world of good for Jeffrey, who then began using the last name Lance, and selected a new birth date, later got married, expanded his family with 4 children, and started his own construction business 20 years after his disappearance. In July 2017, 40 years after Jeffrey failed to show up for work, Veteran Doe uploaded a photo of him from his youth. Veteran Doe is or was a Facebook group dedicated to bringing attention to missing people with military connections. Jeffrey, then 64 years old, was arrested in Florida and handed over to the Air Force. As it turns out, Like murder, there is no statute of limitations for desertion. There is no point at which a service member can be absent for so long that the military no longer cares. The day after Bo Bergdahl pled guilty, the Air Force announced they had Jeffrey in custody. I could find a lot of articles referencing Jeffrey's arrest and the possible repercussions he could face, but very little is available regarding what actually happened next for Jeffrey. He was apprehended in 2017, but I don't see anything from the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals about him after that time, or any articles about what happened next. Maybe Jeffrey knew he wasn't free and clear of the commitment he made to Uncle Sam. Because 6 months before he was arrested, Lindley Lemberg was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment for his desertion. Along with that confinement, Lemberg was sentenced to a reduction to E1, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of pay and allowances, a $2,250 fine, and a reprimand. The convening authority approved the discharge, reduction, forfeiture, and reprimand, but did not approve the fine. Lemberg had joined the Air Force in May 1960 and was initially trained in radio repair. Later, he was accepted into the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and trained to become a special agent. In 1972, while the U.S. was embroiled in the Vietnam War, Staff Sergeant Lemberg was stationed in Philadelphia. There, he worked as a special agent until February 14th, when he stopped showing up for work. He was declared a deserter 30 days later. Apparently at that time, he was having both marital issues and money problems. So he'd picked up a job as a security manager at a department store and separated from his wife. They had filed for divorce before Lemberg started dating somebody that he met through his job at the department store. He was finding it difficult to balance 2 women and 2 jobs, and so, with just 3 months left until his end of active service, Lemberg left. He and his new girlfriend began a new life in Maine. He discarded all of his Air Force paraphernalia and destroyed his military ID and investigator credentials. 45 years after his disappearance in March 2017, special agents at MacDill Air Force Base reached out to the Marion County Sheriff's Office to let them know that they had a 45-year-old arrest warrant for Lemberg. He had spent the preceding 4.5 decades living as William Bill Robertson. Lemberg was arrested just 2 blocks away from his retirement community home, maintaining that he wasn't Lemberg at all, but Bill. It was only after investigators rolled his fingerprints and matched them to the original fingerprint card the Air Force had on file that Lemberg admitted his identity and explained what happened to all of his Air Force gear. He later pled guilty. From what I gather, neighbors and his second wife swore they didn't know anything about Lemberg's double life. One neighbor observed that given his advanced age, they didn't think he should be jailed, just maybe dishonorably discharged. I suspect Lemberg's 15-year sentence was because he deserted during a time of war. Although he'd received that 15-year sentence, his pretrial agreement capped his confinement at 30 days. Before he was sentenced, Lemberg served 21 days in custody, and after his court-martial and sentencing, a base flight surgeon cleared him medically for confinement, certifying that confinement would not produce serious injury to his health. Maybe that's bold for a 75-year-old who needed daily medication. The decision was made to confine Lemberg in the quarters he occupied while restricted to base before his court-martial, until the Hillsborough County Jail made acceptable assurances that Lemberg would receive his medication and appropriate treatment. He spent a total of 37 hours in county jail custody. But after his release, Lemberg appealed his conviction, asserting relief was due to him because of the conditions of his post-trial confinement at the county jail, and that his punitive discharge should be set aside. Lemberg stated that the county jail deliberately withheld his prescribed medications and placed him in solitary confinement, which was less comfortable than he would have been in the general population. To support this assertion, he pointed at a thin mattress, bright lights, and a lack of reading material. The jail responded that Lemberg was confined separately from the general population in a single-person cell, consistent with the agreement it made with MacDill. It was a protective decision. But the cell gave Lemberg day access to the shared common area, which had an enclosed shower, telephone, information kiosk, and television. So, not solitary confinement, just confinement alone. Jail staff reported giving Lemberg his prescriptions as required and reported they didn't receive any complaints from Lemberg during his brief stay. This, the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals determined, did not rise to the level of an Eighth Amendment claim of cruel and unusual punishment. If Eighth Amendment claims of cruel and unusual confinement conditions pique your interest, I'd recommend giving episode 59, The U.S. vs. Lovett, a listen. With those two diversions out of the way, let's turn back to our friend Robinson. Robinson appealed following his special court-martial. The Army Court of Criminal Appeals ordered the parties to brief whether the judge committed error in accepting Robinson's plea to desertion on or around the 4th of November 2019, when his resolve to remain away from the Army allegedly didn't crystallize until 2023. Robinson argued that he hadn't committed desertion until right up until the end there, right after he got hired at Moxie and decided he'd finally found stability for himself and his children. Up until then, he believed, he was just absent without leave. Ultimately, the ACCA concluded that the exact date that Robinson resolved to remain absent didn't much matter to the factual findings, because remaining absent from a unit constitutes desertion, and because resolution to remain absent doesn't have to form the moment a service member leaves his unit. But the ACCA didn't come to that conclusion without speed bumps. There's a concurring opinion that dives into the manner that desertion is charged, which is relevant to an accused's entire period of absence and how much of their obligation remained unfulfilled at the time they committed their desertion. That opinion argued that government counsel only has to prove that an accused left on a certain date, returned on a certain date, and at some point between those two dates formed the mens rea, the mental state, necessary for desertion. There are also two dissents. The first dissent still concluded Robinson deserted the Army, but didn't think it started on November 4th, 2019, when he drove off with his wife and children toward Fayetteville. Instead, the dissent accepts the March 2023 date as the date of desertion, that stability point. They got that date from the plea colloquy. The judge asked, "So around when was it that you decided you weren't coming back?" Robinson answered that it was March 2023. But later in that colloquy, the judge again asked, "But at some point during your absence, did you intend to remain away from your unit permanently?" To that, Robinson replied that it was when he moved to Texas, which was in 2021. Because the judge didn't follow up on that discrepancy, the dissent concluded that March 2023 was the more reliable anchor date, and concluded that the judge erred by accepting a plea that Robinson deserted the Army on November 4th, 2019. The second dissent sought to add additional thoughts and clarity to the first dissent, as though having four opinions somehow makes things clearer. For what it's worth, it does seem like there's some flex in the joints for Robinson and his mens rea, not solely because of the plea colloquy discrepancy, but because this wasn't the first time he had issues showing up for work. He'd already gone missing for 9 months before and returned. Presumably, he didn't get to the point of deciding he and the Army were never getting back together. Maybe when he drove off in November 2019, he thought he'd just take another extended holiday season and return. Maybe COVID changed things for him and that got extended. It would seem to me that going out and getting a whole separate job might be the point at which someone decided their army contract wasn't for them anymore. But I don't know what happened inside Robinson's mind when he filled out his McDonald's application, and neither does a fact finder. Frankly, given the conflicting answers about it being the move to Texas or the Moxie job, it's not clear Robinson really knew when he deserted the army. Details like obtaining the McDonald's job or driving west past his base and continuing on to Texas, those details are things a fact finder might consider when pondering whether, and when, the offense of desertion was committed. For whatever it's worth, as best I can tell, Robinson was booked into the jail in Montgomery County, Tennessee earlier this year, back in January 2025. He was charged with forgery and his bond was set at $15,000. His next hearing is set for February 2026. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate the podcast wherever you listen. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we return to the issue of an on-base arson. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense, or by its new preferred name and pronouns, the Department of War.